Mark's car rolled slowly down the quiet suburban street, the sun dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows over the perfectly manicured lawns. It had been a brutal day, endless meetings, deadlines, and the gnawing stress of a job he barely enjoyed anymore. All he wanted now was to get home, kick off his shoes, and breathe. As he turned onto his street, his heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. There, in the middle of his front yard, looming like a monster, in a place it didn't belong, was a massive semi-truck, the kind you see barreling down highways, not parked like an oversized sculpture in a peaceful neighborhood. Its bright chrome gleamed in the fading sunlight, the engine silent but intimidating. The long trailer stretched across his driveway, blocking his path completely. Mark blinked, rubbed his eyes, convinced he was hallucinating after such a long day. But no, the semi was real, and it was sitting smack in front of his house. He pulled his car to a stop a few feet away, heart pounding. What the hell was going on? His yard was pristine only that morning. He never once thought a semi-truck would end up invading his personal space. Let alone without a word, he stepped out and looked closer. The tires had crushed patches of his freshly planted grass. The smell of diesel hung thick in the air. He spotted no note, no explanation, nothing to explain how or why this had happened. Just then, from the corner of his eye, Mark caught movement. A figure was walking casually down the sidewalk. Karen. The name alone sent a wave of irritation through Mark's veins. She was infamous in the neighborhood, stern, self-righteous, and a member of the HOA board with a reputation for wielding her authority like a weapon. Always watching, always judging, she stopped by the semi and glanced toward Mark, a cold smile creeping across her face. "Good evening, Mark," she said, as if this were all perfectly normal. "I see you've noticed our latest addition." Mark's mouth went dry. What is this? Why is that truck in my front yard?" Karen shrugged, a hint of smugness in her tone. "It's been approved by the HOA." "Approved by the HOA on my property?" Mark asked, disbelief thick in his voice. "I'm not even a member of the HOA." Karen's smile widened, almost triumphant. "Exactly. Which means you have no say in this matter." Mark stared at her, baffled, and growing angrier by the second. "How can you park a semi in someone's yard without asking?" Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. "You don't need to understand. The HOA makes decisions for the neighborhood's greater good. Sometimes sacrifices are necessary." Mark's fists clenched. "This isn't a sacrifice. It's an invasion. You can't just do this." Karen laughed softly, the sound sharp and chilling. "Oh, Mark, you don't know what you're messing with." Before he could say another word, she turned on her heel and strode away, leaving Mark alone with the truck, the fading light, and a growing knot of unease twisting in his gut. He stood there stunned. What exactly had he stumbled into? And why did Karen's parting words feel more like a threat than a simple warning? As dusk settled, Mark realized this was far from over. The semi was more than just a truck. It was the first sign of something much bigger, something he didn't understand yet, but would soon have no choice but to confront. The next morning, Mark woke up restless. The image of the semi-truck still haunted him, like a giant steel beast squatting on his front yard, mocking his right to call the place home. He needed answers, but Karen's parting words from the night before echoed ominously in his mind. "You don't know what you're messing with." Determined not to let this go, Mark grabbed his phone and dialed Karen's number. It rang once, twice, then a sharp click as she picked up. "Karen," Mark started, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need to know how the HOA approved parking a semi-truck on my property. I'm not a member of your association. How is this even possible? There was a pause. Then Karen's cool, measured voice came through. Mark, it's simple. The HOA has jurisdiction over this neighborhood, and that means decisions like this are for the community's benefit. The truck is part of an important project. But it's on my property, Mark shot back. And you didn't ask me. That's because, as I said, you're not a member. The HOA doesn't need your permission. This isn't personal. Her tone was sharp, almost dismissive. Mark swallowed the rising anger. Not personal. This feels like a violation. You can't just decide what happens on someone else's property. Karen's voice hardened. You clearly don't understand the rules. If you wanted to say, you should have joined the HOA, but you didn't. So now you're just an outsider. Mark felt his frustration spike. So, because I'm not part of your club, you can invade my property whenever you want. That's ridiculous. Karen let out a low chuckle. You're missing the bigger picture. This isn't just about parking a truck. It's about the future of this neighborhood. Sometimes tough choices have to be made for the greater good. Before Mark could respond, Karen abruptly ended the call. Mark dropped the phone onto the couch, his mind racing. The greater good. What could be so important that justified this blatant disrespect? And why was Karen so smug about it? He decided to head outside and take a closer look at the semi, hoping to find some clue about the project Karen mentioned. As he approached the truck, he noticed a small sign taped to the door. It read, Property of Evergreen HOA, authorized for community use only. Community use? On his front yard. Mark's confusion grew. He paced around the truck, inspecting the yard damage. Deep tire ruts had shredded the grass and flattened flower beds he'd carefully planted last spring. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an assault on his home. Just then, the door of the truck creaked open. A man in a reflective vest stepped out, eyes scanning the street nervously. Can I help you? Mark asked. The man hesitated, then said, I'm here for the delivery. The truck will be moved soon, but I was told to park here for now. Sorry for the trouble. Mark nodded, but felt no relief. Who told you to park here? The driver looked over his shoulder nervously. The HOA board. They're running some kind of community project, but I don't know the details. Mark's jaw tightened. Everyone seemed to be in the dark, except Karen and her allies. Why the secrecy? That afternoon, Mark headed to the local library to research the HOA itself. As he flipped through public records, he confirmed his worst suspicion. His property wasn't part of the HOA's official boundaries. He wasn't a member, didn't pay HOA dues, and wasn't subject to their rules. Yet Karen insisted otherwise. The contradiction gnawed at him. How could Karen claim authority over his land when the law clearly said she didn't have any? Just then, Mark's phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number popped up. Be careful asking questions. Not everyone wants the truth to come out. Mark stared at the screen, his heart pounding harder than ever. The semi-truck was just the beginning, and now he was getting warned. The text message lingered in Mark's mind like a shadow. Who had sent it? Was it someone from the HOA? Or maybe a neighbor warning him to back off? The uncertainty unsettled him, but it also fueled a fire inside. He was determined to get to the bottom of this. That afternoon, Mark set off for the county courthouse, clutching a stack of HOA documents and maps he'd found online. His goal was simple: find proof that the HOA had no legal authority over his property. Inside the cold, sterile building, Mark navigated to the land records office. An elderly clerk looked up from her desk as he approached. Excuse me, Mark said. I'm trying to get official property maps for the Evergreen neighborhood and the surrounding areas. Specifically, I want to confirm whether my house is within the HOA boundaries. The clerk nodded knowingly. You'll want to look at the subdivision maps and the latest boundary amendments. Some of those documents are filed under HOA special use permits. Mark scanned the files carefully, cross-referencing his address. The printed map confirmed what he suspected. His property sat just outside the official HOA lines. Legally, he wasn't subject to any HOA covenants or restrictions. Still, the mystery deepened when Mark stumbled upon a thick, yellowed binder labeled Evergreen HOA Amendments. Inside, an obscure addendum caught his eye. A handwritten note dated nearly 2 years ago, vaguely referencing expanded community projects and shared community responsibilities. Extending beyond the original boundaries, it was unsigned and referenced no public vote or homeowner notification. His brow furrowed. Could this be the loophole Karen was using? Suddenly, a man's voice startled him. You're poking around where you shouldn't be. Mark turned sharply to see a tall, stern-looking man in a dark suit watching him closely. His presence was intimidating, but Mark squared his shoulders. I'm just doing some research, Mark said calmly, trying to understand how my property is involved with the HOA when I'm not a member. The man's eyes narrowed. Some things are better left alone. That's advice. Before Mark could respond, the man walked away, leaving Mark with a pit growing in his stomach. The warning was clear. The HOA's power extended farther than he realized, and they weren't going to let him uncover their secrets so easily. Back home, Mark paced in front of the semi-truck again, his mind racing. Through the day's discoveries, the truck was still parked there, its presence an ugly reminder that someone had overstepped. Determined to get some perspective, Mark decided to speak with neighbors living near the HOA boundary line. He hoped someone might have insight into the expanded projects or the strange amendment he found. At the third house, a middle-aged woman named Linda answered the door cautiously. After hearing Mark's questions, her eyes darted nervously. You're not the first to ask about that truck, she whispered. Karen's been pushing things for months. Things the rest of us don't fully understand. Mark frowned. What kind of things? Linda glanced over her shoulder before leaning in. She's trying to extend the HOA's control, not just over property, but over our lives. Some neighbors got letters threatening fines for minor infractions. I think that truck is part of some bigger plan. Maybe to enforce or intimidate. Mark's heart pounded. This was worse than he thought. And you? Are you part of the HOA? Linda shook her head. No, I refuse to join because of how Karen runs things. But she acts like everyone's under her thumb anyway. You should be careful. Mark nodded slowly, processing the warning. The semi-truck wasn't just a random act of arrogance. It was a symbol of a creeping power, an invisible force, trying to swallow his property and independence. That evening, as darkness cloaked the neighborhood, Mark sat on his porch, staring at the silent giant of a truck. His phone buzzed again. A new text. Stop digging, Mark, or face the consequences. His hands tightened around the phone. Whatever Karen was planning, it was bigger and darker than he had imagined. But Mark wasn't backing down. If the HOA wanted a fight, he was ready to throw the first punch. Mark's phone buzzed again, just as he was about to call it a night. The message was simple but chilling. Last warning, stay out of HOA business. He stared at the screen, heart pounding, fingers trembling. The threats were no longer subtle. They were escalating. And yet, his determination only grew stronger. He knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. The next morning, Mark knocked on the doors of his closest neighbors, hoping to find allies. But what he found instead was a maze of fear, hesitation, and silent compliance. First, he visited Mr. and Mrs. Carlson, longtime residents who had lived in the neighborhood since before the HOA formed. When Mark mentioned the semi-truck and the HOA's aggressive tactics, Mr. Carlson sighed heavily. "Mark, I understand how upsetting this is," he said quietly. "But Karen's got the board wrapped around her finger, and the board control it a lot. From landscaping to parking, even to who can use the pool. Most people just keep their heads down." Mrs. Carlson nodded, adding, "She's ruthless. People who push back get slapped with fines or worse. You don't want to make enemies here." Mark frowned. "So, no one's willing to stand up?" Before they could answer, a car pulled up across the street, and Mark saw a familiar figure get out. Sarah, a neighbor known for her quiet but sharp mind. Mark had barely spoken to her before, but now he hoped she might be different. He crossed the street and caught her just as she was locking her door. "Sarah, can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked. She glanced around nervously, but nodded. "Sure. What's going on?" Mark quickly explained the semi-truck situation and Karen's claim that the HOA had authority over his property, despite him not being a member. He told her about the threatening texts and the mysterious amendment he found. Sarah's eyes widened. "I've seen that amendment too," she whispered. "It was never really discussed publicly. Some of us suspect Karen manipulated the paperwork to extend the HOA's power without telling anyone." Mark felt a surge of relief. Finally, someone who understood. "But be careful," Sarah warned. "Karen controls the board, and she's got allies everywhere. People who defy her often find their lives made difficult, sometimes worse." Mark's throat tightened. "Have you faced problems too?" Sarah hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Last year, I was hit with a $500 fine for improper landscaping. Basically for planting flowers. Karen didn't approve. I appealed, but the board rejected me without explanation." Mark shook his head in disbelief. "This isn't just petty rules. It's intimidation." Sarah looked around nervously before continuing. "A few neighbors have talked about banding together to challenge the HOA, but no one wants to be the first to stand up. Karen's too powerful, and the HOA controls so much. You risk everything." Mark's jaw clenched. "I don't care. I'm not going to let them treat me like I don't exist." Sarah looked at him with a mixture of admiration and worry. "You're brave, Mark, but you'll need allies. And maybe legal help. This isn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. Just..." Then, a car slowly drove by. Windows rolled down, the driver's eyes fixed on Mark and Sarah. A moment later, a voice called out from the vehicle. "Watch yourself, Mark. You're poking the hornet's nest." The car sped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a fresh wave of fear. Mark and Sarah exchanged glances. The warnings were no longer whispers. They were public, and the stakes were rising. That night, Mark sat alone in his living room, replaying the day's events. The friendly facades of neighbors hid a community gripped by fear. Karen's grip wasn't just on the HOA. It was on everyone. Yet somewhere deep inside, Mark felt the fire burn brighter. He wasn't just fighting for his yard anymore. He was fighting for the neighborhood's soul, and he was ready to face whatever came next. Mark steeled himself as he pushed open the heavy doors of the evergreen HOA clubhouse. The room was dimly lit, filled with stiff folding chairs arranged in neat rows, and a long table at the front where the HOA board sat in judgment. The faces of the board members were familiar, stern, unreadable, almost cold, and at the center, like a queen on a throne, sat Karen. Her gaze locked on Mark the moment he stepped inside, a small triumphant smile tugging at her lips. Mr. Sanders, Karen said smoothly, her voice dripping with false politeness. We weren't expecting you. Mark took a deep breath. I'm here to discuss the semi-truck parked on my property and the so-called community project that no one else seems to know about. Karen's smile didn't falter. This meeting is for members of the HOA only. Since you're not a member, I'm not sure why you're here. Mark squared his shoulders. I may not be a member, but that truck is on my property. I deserve an explanation. The room fell silent. Then, a man with a slick tie and cold eyes spoke up. The truck is part of the Evergreen Community Enhancement Initiative. It's a project approved unanimously by the board and designed to improve neighborhood safety and infrastructure. Mark frowned. But no one outside the board seems to know what that project is, or why it involves parking a semi-truck on private property without consent. Karen's eyes glinted. Some details are confidential, Mr. Sanders. We trust you understand that certain decisions are made in the community's best interest. A murmur rippled through the room. Mark caught a few curious glances from neighbors seated near the back, their expressions guarded. Confidential? Mark echoed. Why keep it a secret from the community you claim to serve? Karen's voice hardened. Because not everyone is ready to understand the complexities involved. Mark's patience snapped. This isn't about complexity. It's about respect and rights. You can't just impose your will on someone else's property and expect silence. Karen leaned forward. You're treading on dangerous ground, Mark. Before Mark could reply, the room's atmosphere shifted. Another board member, a woman with sharp features named Diane, whispered urgently to Karen. Karen's eyes narrowed. As you see, Mr. Sanders, your presence here is disruptive. Perhaps it would be best if you left before this meeting proceeds. Mark shook his head. No, I'm here to get answers. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the room's temperature seemed to drop. Several members exchanged uneasy looks. Then, as if on cue, a phone on the table buzzed loudly. Karen's expression tightened as she glanced at the screen. It appears we have an unexpected development, she said, voice clipped. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. Something was happening behind the scenes. Something they didn't want him to know. Just then, a neighbor seated near the back stood up. It was Sarah. I think the community deserves to know what's going on, she said firmly. The room went still, all eyes on her. Karen's smile twisted. Sarah, you're not on the agenda. Sarah ignored her. We've all been kept in the dark long enough. This enhancement initiative sounds like a cover for something else. We want transparency. Karen's face darkened. You're playing with fire. Mark watched as tension crackled in the air like electricity. The board's calm facade was cracking. Suddenly, the doors to the clubhouse slammed open. Two uniformed security guards stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room. Karen called us, one said. We've received reports of trespassing and harassment related to tonight's meeting. Mark's heart hammered. This was turning into a showdown. Karen stood and addressed the room. This meeting is adjourned. Anyone refusing to leave will be removed. The crowd stirred, some murmuring in confusion, others standing uncertainly. Mark locked eyes with Karen one last time. This isn't over, he said quietly. As he turned to leave, Sarah whispered, They'll come after you next. Outside, the night air was heavy and thick. Mark looked back at the clubhouse. The heavy oak doors now closed behind him. He didn't know what the Community Enhancement Initiative really was yet. But one thing was clear. Karen and the HOA had secrets they were desperate to keep buried, and Mark had just stepped right into the center of the storm. The night air was heavy with tension as Mark stepped away from the clubhouse, his heart still racing. Karen's warning echoed in his mind. You're treading on dangerous ground. But Mark knew he had no choice. The truth was buried somewhere beneath the polished surface of the HOA, and he was determined to dig it out, no matter the cost. Back at home, Mark sat at his kitchen table, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating a stack of HOA documents. He scoured every page, every amendment, every meeting note he could find online. The words blurred as exhaustion threatened to overtake him, but he kept going. Then, suddenly, a message popped up in his inbox. It was from an anonymous sender. Meet me tomorrow night at the old community park, alone. Come if you want the truth. Mark's pulse quickened. Was this a trap or a lifeline? Despite the danger, his curiosity and desperation won. The next evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Mark arrived at the old community park. The place was run down and forgotten, a stark contrast to the manicured lawns of the evergreen neighborhood. The playground was rusted, the benches weathered and cracked. He waited, eyes scanning the shadows. Minutes passed, just as Mark began to doubt. A figure emerged from behind a cluster of trees. A woman in her early 40s, dressed in a dark jacket, her face partly obscured. "You're Mark," she said softly. "And you are." She hesitated, then nodded. "Call me Jenna. I used to be on the HOA board." Mark's heart leapt. "You left?" Jenna looked around nervously before answering. "I had to." Karen's grip on the board became too much. Things started getting strange. "The Community Enhancement Initiative isn't what it seems." Mark leaned in. "What is it?" Jenna swallowed hard. "It's a cover for something far darker. Karen and a few others have been using the HOA as a front for personal gain, acquiring properties, controlling residents, even pushing out those who don't comply." Mark's breath caught. "How?" Jenna pulled out a small folder from her bag. "Here are documents, contracts, emails, financial records. They show how Karen orchestrated secret deals, forcing residents to sell or face endless fines." Mark flipped through the papers, shock mounting. "This is serious. Why are you telling me?" "Because you're not afraid to fight," Jenna said. "And because you're outside the HOA, you have a chance to expose them." Mark's mind raced. But before he could ask more, Jenna's phone buzzed urgently. She looked alarmed. "They're watching me," she whispered. "You have to be careful." Suddenly, headlights swept across the park. A black SUV pulled up, engine idling. Two men in suits stepped out, eyes scanning the area. Jenna grabbed Mark's arm. "Go, now!" They sprinted through the trees, hearts, and pounding as the SUV's headlights followed them like predators. Mark and Jenna disappeared into the darkness, their breaths ragged. Once safe, Jenna pulled out her phone and deleted the message she had sent Mark earlier. "We can't trust anyone," she said grimly. Back at his house, Mark locked the doors and stared at the semi-truck looming outside his window. The vehicle no longer felt like a mere nuisance. It was a symbol of control, intimidation, and secrets too dangerous to ignore. As Mark sat in the silence, his phone buzzed again. A new text from an unknown number. "Stop now, or the consequences will be worse than you imagine." Mark clenched his fists, determination burning in his eyes. They thought they could scare him away. They were wrong. The fight was just beginning. The threats, the secrets, the shadowy warnings. They all pressed down on Mark like a weight he couldn't shake. But instead of backing down, he felt more alive than ever. The semi-truck in his front yard had become a symbol of everything wrong with the evergreen HOA, and he was ready to expose it all. That morning, Mark called Jenna. Their hushed conversation was filled with urgency and whispered plans. Jenna promised to share more evidence she'd kept hidden. Emails, recordings, anything that could dismantle Karen's iron grip. But Mark knew time was running out. Later that day, Mark gathered the neighbors who had shown even the faintest flicker of resistance. In a small circle around his kitchen table, he laid out the documents Jenna had given him: contracts, emails, photographs of the truck, even copies of the threatening texts. Linda, Sarah, Mr. Carlson, and a few others listened, eyes wide with disbelief. "This isn't just about the truck," Mark said. "Karen's been running the HOA like a dictatorship, using it to control who stays, who leaves, and who pays." Sarah nodded, voice low. "I've been fined for the smallest things. Some neighbors have been forced out. The HOA has turned into a weapon." Mark looked around the room. "We can fight back. We need to organize, get legal help, and demand transparency." Linda swallowed hard. "But Karen has lawyers, money, and power on her side. What if they retaliate?" Mark met her gaze. "Then we stand together. No more fear." The group agreed to form a committee, ready to confront the board and demand answers. Mark felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the community could reclaim their neighborhood. But that night, everything changed. Mark returned home to find the semi-truck gone. His heart raced. Where was it? Was this a victory or a warning? He stepped outside, eyes scanning the street. A faint trail of tire marks led away from his yard, disappearing into the night. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. "Look outside." Mark's blood ran cold. He rushed to the window and saw a large, freshly painted sign plastered on his front lawn, illuminated by the streetlight. "Property under HOA control. Trespassers will be prosecuted." Below the bold letters was an intimidating logo: the Evergreen HOA's official seal. Mark's hands shook. This wasn't just about the truck anymore. The HOA had crossed a line, claiming his property as their own. Before he could react, his doorbell rang sharply. He opened the door to find two stern-faced men in suits. "Mr. Sanders," one said, flashing a badge, "we're with the local code enforcement agency. We've received complaints about unauthorized structures and property violations on your land." Mark's mind raced. This was new. No code violations had ever been mentioned before. "We need to inspect your property," the other man added. Mark hesitated, but nodded, knowing refusal would only make things worse. As they walked around the yard, the men made notes, their eyes occasionally flicking to the spot where the truck had been. After the inspection, one officer looked at Mark coldly. "You should consider cooperating with the HOA. They have legal authority here, whether you like it or not." Mark's jaw tightened. "I plan to challenge that." The officers exchanged a glance, but said nothing. When they left, Mark shut the door and leaned against it, breath shaky. The fight had become personal. The HOA wasn't just parking trucks on his yard. They were erasing his ownership, eroding his rights, and Mark knew he needed a plan, fast, because if he didn't act soon, the house he called home might be lost forever. Mark sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by piles of documents, notes, and messages. The confrontation with the HOA had escalated beyond anything he'd imagined. A semi-truck parked on his lawn, threatening texts, false claims over his property, and now legal inspections. Yet, despite it all, Mark's resolve was unwavering. This wasn't just about one man's yard anymore. It was about justice, fairness, and reclaiming the neighborhood's soul. He picked up his phone and dialed Jenna's number. Her voice was calm but urgent when she answered. "I've gathered everything we have," Jenna said. "Financial records, emails, witness statements. It's enough to expose Karen and the board." Mark nodded, even though she couldn't see. Him. What's the next step? We present it to a lawyer, someone who can take this to court and stop them cold. Together, they researched and found a reputable property attorney known for fighting HOA abuses. Mark set up a meeting, determined to get professional help. Meanwhile, word spread quietly through the neighborhood. More residents began stepping forward, sharing stories of harassment, fines, and forced sales. A small but growing coalition was forming, ready to stand up against Karen's tyranny. The night before the court hearing, Mark sat on his porch, the memory of the semi-truck's shadow still fresh in his mind. Sarah joined him quietly, handing him a cup of coffee. "You're doing what no one else dared," she said softly. "Thank you." Mark smiled faintly. "We're in this together now." The next day, the courthouse buzzed with tension. Mark, Jenna, and their newfound allies packed the courtroom, facing a wall of attorneys representing the Evergreen HOA. As the hearing began, Mark's lawyer laid out the evidence: secret amendments, forged approvals, intimidation tactics, and the blatant misuse of HOA power. Witnesses testified about Karen's threats, the mysterious truck, and the signs claiming ownership of private property. Karen sat rigidly, her confident mask beginning to crack under the pressure. After hours of arguments, the judge leaned forward. "The evidence suggests serious overreach by the HOA and questionable amendments without homeowner consent." The judge ruled in Mark's favor. The semi-truck had no right to be on Mark's property, and the HOA's claim over his land was invalid. The HOA was ordered to remove the truck immediately and to cease all harassment against Mark. But the court didn't stop there. The judge mandated an independent audit of the Evergreen HOA's operations and required a full community vote on any future amendments. Outside the courthouse, Mark felt a surge of relief and hope. Neighbors who had once cowered in silence now spoke openly about change. Karen was escorted away, her empire of control crumbling. As Mark walked home, he glanced at his yard, now clear and free. The semi-truck was gone for good, but more importantly, the community had reclaimed its voice. Mark knew the battle was hard fought, but it had forged a new beginning, one where homeowners stood united against tyranny. And as he looked toward the future, he realized that sometimes standing up for what's right means facing the shadows head on. Because in the end, courage is the strongest foundation of all.